Hey everybody, welcome to the shop. Today we've got another sanding heavy video, but nothing near as bad as the bell section from the last part, so I won't be needing the respirator today. I'm going to show you how I take the older lead pipe from old and dingy looking to new looking with a buffed main section and a brushed finish on the receiver section. So make sure you pay attention because I've got lots of great tips in here, and if you like any of those, I suggest liking the video and subscribing now if you aren't already. Let's jump right into it. So the first thing that I'm going to do is set up the trumpet in the vise. I use a cloth to help protect the valves. And I'm also using some very light pressure in the vise so I don't warp the roundness of these valves. In an upcoming video, I'll actually be building a sliding wooden valve block that will help me not have to do this anymore. But for now, what you'll see me removing is the lead pipe as well as the tuning slide receiver. So I use the tuning slide to help get some leverage, but it's a bit too loose, so I'm going to need to switch to a better tool. I try out some pliers, but I'm afraid that these will create a flat spot. So I switched to the expanding slide tube mandrel, which works out quite nicely. However, I am starting to notice that I've put too much heat on this part, and because of its age and the heat, it may be starting to tin, which is when the metals inside of the solder actually kind of fuse together, similar to weld. At this point though, you can see that lead pipe starting to move on the brace as I get the receiver off, and that isn't good. I could be breaking the silver solder, so here I'm checking to see if it was just moving off of the soldered portion or if I was actually hurting the brace. Luckily, I was not damaging the brace. Here you can see the condition of this tuning slide receiver. As you can tell, the lacquer is very worn and some of the heat has burnt the lacquer. So luckily we'll be removing this with some sandpaper at this point. So now I rig up the slide tube expander in the vise and start removing the excess solder with some heat and a Q-tip. Once I remove all the solder from where the braces and pinky hook were attached, as well as inside the tube where the lead pipe inserted, I quench it in some water just so I can handle it more quickly. At this point, this part is ready to be sanded to remove the solder and the unsightly lacquer. So I get it tightly mounted on the slide tube expander, and I cut a piece of 3M sandpaper, it's about 220 grit, and just go to town. The reason I'm having to do it this way instead of using the mandrel that I just made in a previous part is actually because part of my lathe, one of the plastic pulley gears, actually broke, and so I've got to use this slower hand process where I have to rotate the tube every time I want to get to a new part to sand. But I will be making a video, possibly the very next video, on replacing that part so I can get back to a quicker. Now I just use a Scotch-Brite pad using that same twisting linear motion to get a nice cloudy finish on this part. Now I'll remove all of the grit and grime from the Scotch-Brite pad just with some grease remover, and here you can see the cloudy finish that we were going for. I'll turn my attention to the lead pipe at this point, and the first step is to remove the extra solder. So I'll use the slide tube expander just on the larger end of the lead pipe and use the same, heating it with a small micro torch and a Q-tip to remove the extra solder. A quick dip with some water will cool this down and let me handle this. Now I can't actually sand this using the same process because of the stick out, so I'll need to move over to the lathe and use some end support with the tailstock. To get this mounted in the lathe, I will attach a mouthpiece to the receiver, just a normal fit, and then I will put that mouthpiece in the 3-jaw chuck, use the live center on the other side in a locked tailstock, and then I tighten down the chuck to make sure everything rotates together. Like I said before, my lathe is currently out of commission due to the timing belt. The keyway inside of it was stripped due to a slightly heavier operation that I was doing for a different video. While this setup will take me longer to do the actual scratches with the sandpaper and removing of the lacquer material, it is nice because I can very precisely control the angles that I'm using the sandpaper at, which ultimately will affect the end surface finish. even though the result that I'm getting right now from the sandpaper isn't what I'm ultimately going for, except on this receiver, it will say using this 220 finish. The main section of the lead pipe uses different sandpaper, and the scratches need to go in the same direction so that when I use the Scotch-Brite pad, that the cloudiness appears the way that I want it to ultimately. So at this point I go back and start correcting the direction of those scratch lines. It's basically just a 45-degree angle, but I do have to pay attention to the evenness of the angles when I rotate the chuck and the lead pipe just slightly. So I go over it several times to make sure that the overlaps transition smoothly. At this point I do grab the Scotch-Brite and I actually cloud up the entire length of the lead pipe, including the receiver. But here in the next part, you'll see that I do keep the receiver cloudy, and you'll see a nice shiny version of the rest of the lead pipe. So now I will remove the lead pipe from this setup and go ahead and remove all the grease and grime with some grease remover. And here you can see that clouded finish across the entire length of the lead pipe. Using this Scotch-Brite actually sets up the finish really well for buffing, as you'll see in this next part. This also has the benefit of showing me a couple of the small dents that I will remove right now. So I grab my V-block, which allows me to hold the mandrels in this vise, and it has 3 points of contact, which really help solidify the position and have a really great grip. Again, I do a quick pass with the Scotch-Brite and remove any of that grime, making sure that this mandrel is clean and has flat surfaces. I do a quick rub down with this petroleum jelly, ensuring that all of the surface is slippery and it protects the mandrel and the brass from damage. When I'm removing this type of dent from a lead pipe, I'm really making sure to use one of the thickest parts of the mandrel and getting it to be right underneath the dent so that it's kind of pivoting along it, and then I'm pressing lightly into the mandrel with the brass. Again, because the steel is much harder than the brass, it moves the brass very slightly. I also use a nylon hammer, hitting it in the center of that dent to persuade it with some linear presses along the steel mandrel, and this really helps ensure that the contours match the original design. I go back in for another very small dent and remove this rather quickly, and I don't need the hammer for this one. I do give this lead pipe a quick clean with a snake and some of the grease remover, just to remove any of the sanding dust that may have gotten in there. And here you can see what the inside of that lead pipe looks like now that the dents are removed. What I'm looking for when I look down the lead pipe is how the light distorts off of the surfaces, and if there's any dents, they will kind of distort how the light reflects. That darker spot you see in the middle is actually just some grime. Now I will start prepping this tuning slide by removing the water key. This has a small screw in it that isn't threaded all the way, but does need to come off, so I get some pliers and just rotate that off, and so I can remove the water key. This does take slightly longer than I was expecting, but then again, this horn had been sitting out on the porch for 10 years. I'll unscrew the last part by hand, and now you can see the current condition of this tuning slide. I have a suspicion that those ferrules aren't actually brass, and we're going to sand off the lacquer here to check that. So again, I use the slide expander setup and cut a small strip of the 220 grit sandpaper. And as you can see, that silver shining through is actually nickel. So this kind of just goes to show that some of these student line horns were still using the premium materials, whereas nowadays lots of the materials are just the simplest form of brass. In the example of King and Olds, they would still use all of the same parts, but for King, for example, all they did was use some gold lacquer over their nickel ferrules. Now it's time to buff those slide legs, so I clear my space, grab my small buffing wheel, and get to work. I apply some white rouge compound, which is a little aggressive, but will truly give a nice sheen to this raw brass portion of the lead pipe. As you can tell, one of the disadvantages of these smaller Harbor Freight buffers is that they jump around on you just a little bit. But this has more to do with the fact that I don't have this tool screwed down into the workbench. So a quick spray with the degreaser and the shop cloth, and now you can see what this buffed up lead pipe looks like. And here you can see the receiver, which will remain in this brushed cloudy finish. Different parts of this horn will either have a buffed shiny finish or that brushed cloudy finish. At this point, I get a little bit out of order and put away the buffer, even though I need to get it right back out, because I'm going to buff the slides rather than sanding them. We don't want to remove that much material. So you can see the current kind of wear on these slides, and as I buff them, they're going to be a lot smoother to operate. While I'm using this buffer, it's important that I keep in mind that I'm letting it do all the work. When the rouge is getting worn off, I apply some more, and I don't want to press too much into the buffing wheel, as that one will remove more material and it will make it harder to control the buffer, which again could be improved by just screwing it down, but I don't really have the workbench space for that at the moment. After I put away this buffer, I just give the parts a quick degrease with the shop towel and the goof off, and then now you can see what these slides look like now that they are buffed up. As you can see, all these slides now are a lot more clean. There's no dirt and grime on them, and these will be able to operate a lot more smoothly, and also with grease ensure a very tight seal between the valve and the valve slide. Now the last thing to do is set back up for removing the gold lacquer from the rest of those ferrules, as I discovered from the tuning slide, so that all of these match aesthetically. The sandpaper that I'm using here is thinner because these ferrules are not very big, and on the second valve slide I actually have to fold this sandpaper in half in order to make sure that I'm not removing any of the lacquer on the crook or sanding the slide on the other side. I think revealing all of this nickel will really help lend a very nice aesthetic to this horn, even though it is just a King 600 student model. There we have it. That's how I took the lead pipe from that older, rough condition to this nice two-tone look with the brushed receiver and the buffed main section. It was in great shape, as it didn't really have very many dents, but I was a bit surprised to find that the ferrules on these horns, the King 600s of the time, were made from nickel. It just goes to show the marketing that they were using at the time, not really wanting to change their factory processes, and opted to just use some gold lacquer instead of keeping them raw like in their higher end models. In the meantime, if you want to know when I post more videos, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon. Thanks for stopping by the shop.